This is a fan-generated show. If you would like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com, and also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. Tonight, Dr. Jordan Peterson on non-traditional gender pronouns. What an honor it is to have Dr. Jordan Peterson on the program. Dr. Peterson, welcome to the Glazov Gang.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Dr. Peterson, why don't we just begin? Introduce our audience to this controversy and how you stand in it.
Well, Canada is introducing new legislation at the federal level that's already in place in many Canadian provinces, our equivalent of states. And the legislation adds gender identity and gender expression to the list of protected groups. And the policy surrounding Bill C-16, as the legislation is known, mandates the use of preferred pronouns. And that's the pronouns that are chosen by whoever it is that decides to be addressed in a certain way. And it's the first instance that I know of in Canadian law of what you might describe as compelled speech in the non-commercial domain. So there are obviously limitations on free speech, like you can't incite someone to a criminal act and you can't make a direct bodily threat. Those are regulations on that govern what you can't say. But this is the first legislation that I know of in Canadian history that imposes the necessity of using a certain kind of linguistic formulation under penalty of Canadian law, and that's penalties including, at least in principle, the hate crime provisions of the Canadian Criminal Code.
Okay, Dr. Peterson, now you're a psychology professor at the University of Toronto. What's happening on that campus? How are you resisting it, and how or why might you get in trouble now in terms of what you've just said?
Well, most of this kicked in around October after I made a couple of videos. I made one video suggesting that I wasn't going to use these pronouns that I regard as the ideological utterances of postmodern neo-Marxist radicals, essentially, and that I felt that I wasn't required to be the mouthpiece for their particular brand of social constructionist ideology. And the university sent me 2 warning letters as a consequence of that, claiming in one of them that I was contributing to the development of an unsafe space on campus and asking me to cease and desist with regards to my pronouncements on this particular topic.
Okay, now let's say you didn't make any pronouncements, but let's say you have a student in class that wants to be referred to a certain way, and has this happened and where you refuse to do so? Let's say,
No.
Okay.
Nothing direct like that has happened. My comments were directed specifically towards the fact that this was going to be instantiated in the legislation. Right. I also made another video criticizing the University of Toronto's Human Resources Department's decision to make unconscious bias retraining mandatory for their staff on the presumption that such things can be diagnosed with certain kinds of psychological tests, usually the implicit association test, and then that people should be educated out of their so-called implicit racial biases by mandate of their employer. And I also felt that that was an imposition on their civil liberties, and certainly not something that an employer should dare to mess with. So that was another part of the controversy that has provoked a tremendous reaction in Canada and also to some degree internationally.
Okay, Dr. Peterson, now you're in the psychology department. What's interesting here, I was watching you on one of your debates with another individual, and they were saying, Dr. Peterson, why can't you just be nice, be kind? And you had a very profound answer that if you actually surrender to this agenda, that in fact the people that are asking you to be kind, in the end you might be hurting these people by your kindness.
The agenda that's being pushed by the people who put these sorts of things forward is always the same thing. They identify some group that they consider historically oppressed, and then they claim that around that group they divide the world into oppressor and oppressed, and then they charge the oppressors with the necessity for transforming their behavior in some dictated way, and then they make the claim that that's going to necessarily be good for the oppressed group. And here's the problem with that. I mean, there are a multitude of problems, but I can point out one practical issue. So this issue happened to center on the hypothetical rights of transgendered people and the activists that purport to speak for them. But since I've made my stance public, I've received about 30 letters from transgendered people. And 29 of those letters are in favor of what I've been saying. And they point out first that these transgender activists who are driven by a postmodern neo-Marxist agenda are not their legitimate representatives. They have no mandate to speak for them. And that as far as so not only are they illegitimate representatives, but they believe, first of all, that their interests aren't best served by making this pronoun issue paramount like it has become, and it's actually hurt them rather than helped them. And so the idea that there's some evidence that me merely being nice on this issue is going to be in the service of the rights of transgendered people is patently absurd. Right. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. And so it's easy for people who are continually pushing the oppressor-oppressed dichotomy to insist that the oppressed are being, well, obviously oppressive. And if they would just stop doing that and be polite and kind, that the world would sort itself out around them. And that's just, I don't see any evidence for that whatsoever. Quite the contrary.
Right, Dr. Peterson. Now, part of this agenda of pushing for these non-traditional gender pronouns, or, for all these, dozens or thousands of categories, I don't know how many there are now. One of the assumptions is that there is no biological reality. Could you speak about that in terms of there is this one assumption that gender is somehow fluid and a person can decide their own gender at any given moment?
Well, this is another reason that I objected to the legislation, because what's happened, I mean, you can imagine that there's two fundamental ways of conceptualizing the development of, let's call it, sexual identity. And one of the contributing factors to the development of sexual identity is obviously, at least in principle, biology. And the other one, at least in principle, is culture. Now, the social constructionists, so those are the postmodern types that are pushing this kind of agenda, insist that sexual identity should be described as gender identity because it's primarily a social construct. And so it's a consequence of socialization. And so, that you can make a reasonable case for that, although it's limited because it completely eliminates the potential role of biology in what's obviously, at least in part, a biological issue. But the new legislation in Canada even makes a mockery of the strict social constructionist philosophy by insisting that, and this is the other thing that I was objecting to, there's a legal insistence now in the policies surrounding Bill C-16 that sexual identity, gender expression, which is basically the manner in which you choose to present yourself from a fashion perspective, and that's written into the policies, I'm not making that up, and sexual proclivity vary independently of one another. And that's patently false because the correlation between biological sex and gender identity is almost perfect. Almost everyone who's biologically male identifies as male. Almost everyone who identifies as male presents themselves as male. And almost everyone who's biologically male assumes they're male and presents themselves male is heterosexual. So the idea that those phenomena vary independently, and then even worse, that they can be determined by something as casual as someone's, momentary individual choice is internally paradoxical, a radically oversimplified view of identity, complete denial of the underlying biological reality. And so it's completely untenable. And none of that should be written into policies that are designed to become law.
Right, but Dr. Peterson, but they are. And so you're stressing that also there's a danger because this is on the legislative level now. And largely what this is about, I'm sure there's lots of agendas here, but it's these totalitarian forces are possessing the right to control the language that we use.
Yes, and also to enforce their particular view of human identity by legislative fiat, even though there's, one of the one of the radical activist types that I debated on Canadian public television was bold enough to state publicly that the scientific consensus over the last 4 decades was that there were no biological differences between men and women. I mean, he said that with no hesitation, no embarrassment, and no sense of absurdity. It's completely absurd. And yet this is being taught, not only is this taught as doctrine, increasingly in the schools, in the secondary schools. And believe me, like it's spreading everywhere as rapidly as you could possibly imagine.
No, absolute. Yep. Yeah, absolutely, Dr. Peterson. So look, maybe I'm some kind of barbaric man from the Stone Age that can't keep up with all this, but okay, so there's all these new identities and categories. For instance, I've read up that, for instance, there's a category of Zer or something. Am I correct?
Yeah, well, there's about 70 different gender identities now that are hypothetically recognized by Facebook, for example.
Okay, so just hypothetically, there's a Zer. So let's say there's a professor on a campus and a student doesn't want to be referred to as she or he, but wants to be referred to as Zer, and that professor forgets and refers to her because it's a female as she, this person could get charged in the future?
Well, they're certainly going to be in violation of the university policies, and then yes, that can be grounds for a charge of harassment or discrimination. And they can be brought before the appropriate, they call them social justice tribunals. And the particular social justice tribunal in Ontario is the Human Rights Tribunal. And then they can be subject to fines and that sort of thing. And failure to pay the fines would put you into a more serious court proceeding, with the consequence of that incarceration.
Wow. Now, Dr. Peterson, I've studied the left since I was a little kid, and none of this surprises me. You know, we've got the self-appointed redeemers that believe, and for instance, I'm just speaking for myself. I'm not putting any words in your mouth. I'm not sure what faith you are. As a Christian, I see, and as Christians, we see that the left clearly doesn't believe that God is behind redemption or Jesus Christ is behind redemption, that we are the self-appointed redeemers. We're going to redeem the earth. Leftists make themselves gods and believe that they can create a perfect planet, and we know where that ends up. But there's no coincidence that there was unisex Maoist clothing. There's no coincidence that they support the burqa. They hate differences. They hate God's creation. Could you comment on that in terms of your observation that there's a totalitarian streak here to blur genders, to erase individuality? There's a certain totality, a certain collectivism that the left wants to enforce here. They hate differences between humans.
Yeah, well, to me, it's more a consequence of their continued assault on what they describe as patriarchal structures. And the patriarchal structure that they're most opposed to is the Western patriarchal structure for reasons that are not obviously clear. And their assault on language, which is what I regard this as, is part of their desire to break down the categories that Western society has used traditionally to orient itself. Mm-hmm. And that's, at least in principle, to bring about the future utopia where inequality is eradicated and equity rules. And that strikes me as another thing that's really started to emerge in Canada is a constant push now, and this is happening a lot in the universities, but also in corporations even to some degree, is the idea that any organization that doesn't produce completely equitable outcomes according to the categories, the group categories that are fashionable at the moment, is to be regarded as intrinsically racist or sexist and to be reorganized. And it is part of a totalitarian vision. And the problem with the equity claims, as far as I can tell, is that there's a very large number of ways that you can categorize human beings into groups. You can use racial categories or sex categories or gender categories or sexual proclivity categories, but you can also use age and attractiveness and ability and health and intelligence and temperament, etc., all being perfectly reasonable categories for grouping people, but there's no possible way that you can equate for social outcome across all of those categories. It's technically impossible, and to attempt to do that means to extend a degree of control over the functioning of individuals and institutions that's going to cause far more harm than good.
Very true. Dr. Peterson, also, as we know, these totalitarians, when they're imposing their totalitarian structures, they love playing the victim. And in your case, they point at you, oh, it's because of you that trans people have difficulty or committing suicide or suffering. What do you make of this accusation that somehow you're this persecutor that's causing the suffering of, let's say, trans people with your position?
Well, I think it's the standard kind of argument. This is where the postmodernists sort of devolve into their underlying neo-Marxism, because the fundamental premise of Marxism was that the world is into the economic oppressor and the economic oppressed. And that gives you a schema for starting to do large-scale social manipulation and maneuvering in a political sense. And that view became rather unpopular by the late 1960s and early 1970s, when it became obvious that societies that were attempting to organize themselves around those suppositions were failing dreadfully, and also were tended towards extreme internal violence, like the Soviet Union and Maoist China and so on. And what happened instead was, in the 1970s, the Marxists went underground with a bit of intellectual sleight of hand and transformed the landscape of oppression from economic to cultural. And so they just kept playing the same game. And so their game is to divide the world into oppressor and oppressed, and then to prosecute the hypothetical oppressors. And it's the same old Marxist wolf in the new sheep clothing. And we know it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because it's technically not tenable. You cannot equate people across group identities. It's impossible.
Dr. Peterson, let me ask you this. We just have a few minutes left, just briefly, if you don't mind. I have so much respect for you and for all noble, courageous people, especially during this time. Like, I even watch you on some of those Canadian talk shows, and even the so-called moderators, you can just see how terrified they are not to break the party line of the left. So many people surrender on this issue. So many people won't even whisper a word. What makes you stand up and face these slanders and even face prosecution? What has made you courageous in this realm?
Well, I don't necessarily think that it's courage. I think that it's a choice between alternatives. Many times in life you have a bad alternative on the one hand and a bad alternative on the other. And for me, like, I'm very concerned with language use, with personal language use. I try very carefully to formulate my thoughts and to articulate them carefully and to make what I'm saying clear, and to only say the things that I stand behind. And the reason that I regard that as central to what allows me to navigate through life successfully for myself and for the people that depend upon me. It's my primary attribute, let's say, and I believe it's the primary attribute of civilization and of civilized people. That's the ability to formulate language in an articulate manner. You were referring to Christianity earlier, and one of the hallmark assumptions of Christianity is that human beings are manifestations, at least partial manifestations, or at least partake in the spirit of the Logos. Yeah. And the Logos is the word that generates order out of chaos at the beginning of time. It's the fundamental attribute of Christ, for example. And it's our ability to utter articulate speech upon which our success, the success of our souls, let's say, depends. And I'm not going to subjugate that ability to the dictates of neo-Marxist ideological radicals, whose philosophy I find not only contemptible, but downright murderous. And so it's not a matter of courage precisely, it's a matter of putting priorities first. There's nothing more important to me than my ability to use my language the way I see fit. Nothing.
Dr. Peterson, thank you very much. Now, to those of our viewers who you've inspired and they want to support you and contact you, is there a website they can go to, or how does one support you in your battle?
Well, if you want to see more of the things that I've been talking about, you can go to Jordan Peterson videos on YouTube. I have jordanbpeterson.com, but the YouTube site is probably the best. There's about 500 hours of lectures there, some on political topics, although the minority of my videos are overtly political. Most of them have to do with an analysis of a psychological analysis, for example, of belief systems or of personality. And people can go there and watch the videos and if they're inclined to support me, there's a link there to my Patreon site, which is helping me fund the development of further educational videos. About 8 million people have watched them so far. And I'm going to do a series starting in May on the psychological significance of the biblical stories. I'm going to start at Genesis and work my way through the entire document. And so that's coming up. That should start May 16th or so.
Fantastic. Fascinating stuff. Before we go, under 30 seconds, please, if these totalitarians achieve their agenda, what might our planet or Canada look like, let's say, in 10 years? Give us a scenario.
Well, I think what will happen is that we're going to become more fractious and divided. You already see that happening, particularly in the United States, where the left and the right are starting to speak different languages and no longer be able to communicate with one another. And that makes a society narrow and weak as that polarization occurs, because you can't stop talking to the people that you live with. If you do that, then you either become their slaves or you fight with them. And the alternative to the free exchange of ideas is either slavery or combat. And those are not good options.
Right. Dr. Peterson, thank you so much for joining the Glazov Gang and for all that you do.
Thanks very much for the invitation.
And before I go, we have a mutual friend, Valerie Price at actforcanada.ca, that brought us together. So I'd like to give Valerie Price a shout out.
Yeah, well, thank you to Valerie as well.
Valerie is number one. Dr. Jordan Peterson, thank you, and we hope we'll see you on the Glazov Gang soon.
Thanks very much for the invitation.
Thank you for joining the Glazov Gang tonight. Remember, we're a fan-generated program. If you like what we do, please support us at jamieglazov.com and make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel of the Glazov Gang. Good night.
This episode was sponsored by the coolest and loveliest woman walking the planet Earth as we speak, Valerie Price, the Canadian godmother of the Glazov Gang. She is also the head of Act for Canada, the Canadian chapter of Bridget Gabriel's group Act for America. Our dear Valerie, we want you to know how much we love you and cherish you, not only for the beautiful person you are, but also for all that you do from your heart and soul for freedom and freedom fighters all around the world. Thank you for being our sparkling Canadian queen. We appreciate you forever and ever.